Hey everyone, this is Jennifer Beamer, owner-operator of ExpertlyDyed Art by Science, and today we're going to be talking about yarn grist. For those of you who are viewers of my channel, thank you for being here and welcome back. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if there's anything else you want to contribute, be sure to put that in the comments below. If you're new here, I would really appreciate it that if you like the content, please subscribe so that you can see it in the future. Give it a thumbs up and share it around to your other friends. And if you are interested in getting to know more about spinning, I have other videos available. Plus, I am a fiber artist, so if you're looking for some supplies, you can also support me on my shop. Okay, so what the heck is grist? Well, broadly speaking, a very, very loose definition is the gauge of the yarn, or diameter of the yarn. So if you were to take a cross-section of the yarn and then measure that diameter, it would be, let's say, 0.3 millimeters, or maybe it would be more like 1.0 millimeters. And that has to do with two factors. One is how many fibers are going into that gauge of yarn, and two is the amount of twist. This can also be altered by other factors such as drafting method, fiber that you're working with, and also how you're spinning it in terms of technique. Okay, so grist is often talked about in yards per pound, and that has to do with the number of yards that you have of a skein of yarn for 453 grams or 16 ounces. However, it's really difficult to discuss yards per pound worldwide because most people end up using the metric system. But also I feel like it's less convenient to talk about partial ounces and much easier to talk about grams. So whenever I do my calculations, I base it on grams rather than pounds or ounces, just because it's more accessible for everyone else. And so when I'm giving my examples here, I'm going to opt more for discussing it with metric units. But it isn't scary because if you don't understand some of the things I'm saying, you can always take the numbers I'm giving you in grams and convert it into ounces so that you can kind of get a better sense of what I'm talking about as smaller portions of ounces, because maybe that's easier for you. So in this first bit, what I wanted to do was talk about my history with yarn gauge. This is an extremely vivid green, which I hope you can kind of see in the video. But I spun this with a drop spindle that I got for my first master's dissertation because I needed it to make hand spun for making surrogate samples for experimentation. And I didn't know how to spin at the time, but I was a knitter. And so I thought, well, it's useful to do this from scratch, and I didn't want to have to worry about outsourcing that part because I was already dealing with physics, and physics is hard. So I decided afterwards that I kind of enjoyed it, so I kept doing it. And when I finally gave up the park and draft method, which arguably I kind of stuck with a little bit too long, but hey, we all need our training wheels. And so this is one of those first probably dozen or so yarns that I made, and it was all with the drop spindle. Or for those of you who don't like it to be called drop spindle, it was a suspended spindle, because I don't think most of us drop spindles after those first few skeins. So yeah, this is an important lesson in how something looks, may be different in terms of what our visual acuity can detect, especially with the thinner yarn, than what the numbers are actually telling us. So in this skein here, we have 280 yards and 50 grams. And in the second one, I have 331 yards and 70 grams. So what does that equate to? I opened up the clock function. Do you ever do that? You're looking for a specific app and then your brain goes right to, I need to set my time so that I can go to bed and wake up at a certain time. Okay, so all we're going to do with the calculator is take 331 yards divided by 70 grams, and we have roughly 4.7 yards per gram. So that's for that one. And then the second one was 280 yards divided by 50 grams. So that's 5.6 yards per gram. Now, these are very, very small numbers that we're talking about. Only, it's less than 1 yard difference between these two. However, that translates into a very minuscule difference in terms of the grist, or the diameter of the yarn. And when you've done the calculation, it's an incredible thing, but your eyes detect, oh yes, now I can see where this is different. So I don't know if you can really see, but this one in my right hand is a little bit smaller, and that's because there's less wool. There's 50 grams in this one. This one was 70, so it looks a little fatter. Hopefully you can see that. But when just doing a side-by-side comparison and kind of pulling out the threads in the skein a little bit like this, just to kind of see the range inside, I can actually see that this one is ever so slightly thicker than this one. So if you're ever in doubt and you've spun something ages ago and you want to use all that hand spun for a project, always weigh, always measure, and do this very simple calculation to see how you need to proceed with your project, whether it's alternating rows or using the bulk of the hand spun in the body of a sweater and then the slightly different gauge for the sleeves. Maybe dividing up your project where it's like, oh, it's going to be too of a hectic thing for me to remember, so you can use some hand spun with a different project, and then even though it's the same color, you can use it for something else. I think I had earmarked this for making socks, and actually that probably wouldn't be a bad idea given that there's a slight difference in gauge, but they go on your feet and no one's really going to see them except you. So gauge isn't going to be quite as important for that. So I've had this since I think 2011 when I spun it. So sometimes stuff just hangs around in your stash, and I honestly did not know what the difference was in gauge, except for a visual comparison that I made recently, until I did this calculation just now. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what yarn grist is and how to do a calculation, but what are some tips on how to manage your grist? Well, you're in luck because someone actually has already made that video. All right, so the first tip that she gives is keep a sample reference handy throughout the duration of your project. Now, that could be an entire skein of yarn so that you can match the second one to it, or it could be a really simple 1 yard piece that you loop around your wheel or keep in your project bag so that you can constantly refer back to that sample. Okay, so our second tip is basically spin one project at a time. Now, I realize that can be a little bit challenging for people, and if you are like me, I have a wheel that I like to use, but I also like to do some experiments and exploring other types of tools. So I have usually a project that I'm doing at the wheel and another project that I'm doing with my supported spindle, which can cause certain gestures to change, and then because you have a time span in between, switching between projects, your grist or your yarn gauge can start to suffer from that. And so if you want to ensure consistent gauge throughout your project, spin as much of it as possible without interruption. Leading on to that was the third point, which is if you start a project with a specific equipment, yarn gauge will vary if you go from one type of tool to a different type of tool, especially if they're fundamentally different ways of operating the tool. So if you're going to use an electric spinner or a spinning wheel, that can actually change your gauge a little bit. If you're going from doing a worsted style wheel spun yarn to a woolen style supported spindle method, like I've done, it can actually interfere with how consistent your gauge is. And especially when you're new and you're still developing a lot of muscle memory and understanding more about technique, changing the types of equipment, spinning some of it on a spindle, then spinning the rest of it on a wheel can cause future problems. So if you're going to start on a project, it's generally advised to kind of stick with that equipment so that you can have consistent yarn gauge. Number 4, draft consistently. So when you're sitting at the wheel or you're there with your spindle, how you draft can interfere with how many fibers get put into the yarn, and it can actually happen without really paying attention to it at first. So one of the things that you want to do is while you're drafting, draft consistently. So if you pick a method to draft, make sure that you always draft it to that diameter. So if you've got, let's say, a combed top and you've been splitting it from the top to the bottom long ways, continue doing that with the next braid that you use, because if you don't, there's a tendency that you're going to get too many yarns caught into the grist. And then the 5th point leading on to that is if you do any pre-drafting, which I often do, make sure that you pre-draft consistently as well. So that kind of fits with the same principle, where if you have a system where you pre-draft and then you sit down at the wheel and then you continue drafting more to make your yarn, you'll end up with a very consistent product. Whereas if you pre-draft half your fiber and then draft at the wheel, and then the second half you just draft at the wheel, you are going to more likely end up with different yarn grist at the end. Jillian also gave a bonus tip, which is basically what I mentioned at the start, which is if you find yourself in a situation where your yarn gauge is a little bit off, do this calculation to find out whether it's going to be a massive difference, because it could just be a difference of 4.4 yards per gram or 4.8 yards per gram. That might be small enough where it wouldn't be detectable. But if it's more like 1 or 2 or 5 yards difference per gram, obviously it's going to be very noticeable in how the fabric looks, how it feels, how it drapes, whether you have it look presentable in a particular type of pattern. It can actually change quite a lot how it just reacts whenever you have, let's say for example, a cable pattern. So keeping track of whether or not your yarn is a consistent gauge or not can actually make or break a project. So if you find yourself in that situation, you've done the calculation and you haven't committed all that time to knitting something, and then you're like, oh no, what do I do now? I thought I would also give you an updated example of what happens when you don't pay attention to yarn grist. Now, I was going to be spinning this, it's a 70-30 blend of blue face Leicester and silk, and I wanted to make a pair of mittens with color work for my mom, except there must have been something about this gauge that when I initially started it, it was perfect, and then it started to veer off. Now, one of the things I find really amusing about this is I should have known better, because I remember detecting that it felt a little thick, but I didn't go back to check. Now, even though this was spun 9 years later, so this was 2011, and I spun this last year during the pandemic, 2020, and when I got to the end, and then I started to put it onto my Nitty Naughty for skeinin, there was a very dramatic shift from the point where I spun probably about a third of the wool, and then I probably had it sitting for a month or two. And when I came back to it, I just picked it up and continued on as if I am infallible, which I'm totally not. And I ended up producing this very beautiful color that I can't use now for mittens, because with color work, I can't just take off some stitches so that it fits better. And because it's the front end of the skein that is a thinner gauge than the latter end of the skein, which is a thicker gauge, it's going to just make, you know, mismatched mittens, and that just, it feels annoying because you're usually symmetrical. You know, you don't have one hand that's dramatically bigger than the other usually. So I was just thinking, I can't use that for use this for that project, so I'm gonna have to do something else with it, probably weaving, because gauge may not matter as much. And I can use either the thinner end for the warp, or I could use the thicker end for the warp and then switch it up so that no one would ever notice. So always go back, because you can make beginner mistakes, and even though you know, I should have known better, it's a reminder that we're dealing with natural products, and they kind of like to assert themselves even in the middle of you doing a project that seems pretty straightforward, spinning some yarn for some mittens. Now for my tips, because this is an original video and I've just mainly recapped what someone else said, so let's add to the story how you can improve your yarn grist. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to say about yarn grist actually came from something that I read for my PhD thesis, and it got me thinking about perception of grist, and how sometimes we make one conclusion about why something is the case when actually I think there's probably multiple reasons. And so I wanted to give you this case study from Katrin Kanya's research paper, which looked at spindle whorl moment of inertia with hobby spinners. I think she had 10 volunteer spinners, and they did 14 samples each, and then she was trying to understand how with these different types of spindles spinners engaged with it, because she was interested in the role of crafter and how variability comes about during the process of spinning. And like Katrin Kanya, I'm very much in a similar boat where I think a lot of yarns are influenced by the spinner. And even if you have the same kinds of tools, there's still quite a bit of variability. But I wanted to discuss this one point that she raises. So from these 10 samples, Katrin Kanya found that there was less variation in the yarn diameter, or grist, noted with a 5-gram whorl than with a 52-gram whorl. And what was curious is the 5-gram and the 15-gram whorl had very similar narrow bell curve distributions of diameters than with the 52-gram whorl, where the variation was producing a very broad bell curve. Now what she concluded was the indoctrination with spinners, where the the smaller spindles should produce thinner yarns, whereas the larger spindles should produce thicker yarns. But not everyone had the same idea of what a thick yarn was. And whereas I do believe there's a lot of truth in this statement, because it's very much the same thing I heard when I was first really getting into the hobby part of my experience with spinning rather than my more academic purpose, as I said before with my experiments for my first master's degree. But I think there's actually something more at play here, and it has to do with the amount of fibers that go into the creation of a single yarn. And I will show you with this little graphic. So, if you are making a thick yarn, or if you are making a thin yarn, you are still bound by how big your hands are and how wide you can fan out the fibers in your grist to see how many fibers are going into it. So if we look at the one on the right, my right, your left, your left. When you look at your left, you can see all of these dark lines, and that represents a lot more fibers going into that yarn. And there's only so much space in which you can fan those out comfortably. The second has this here on the right, a thinner yarn being produced, and a similar way of fanning out the fibers so that you can see the fibers are much more individuated than they are in this one. And so I strongly believe that this is one reason why spinners will often deal with difficulty with creating a very consistent yarn gauge, and it has to do with the size of the yarn that you're making to a particular extent. Now, there's loads and loads and loads of different reasons that can influence this yarn gauge. But if you're just looking at ways to improve your yarn grist consistency, spinning a thicker yarn is going to produce a lot more variation in the total gauge than it will if you spin a thinner yarn. So if you want to improve your yarn gauge consistency, opt to ply. That way, when you are spinning, you have much more control over your gauge by how many fibers are going in than you do with a thicker yarn, even though technically this is faster. In this next section of the video, I'm going to show you a few areas where you can check your grist while you're in the middle of spinning. That will help you make sure that you're using the right grist for your yarn, and so that you make consistent yarn overall. So here I am just spinning along, pulling open the fibers a little bit more so that I can see how many fibers I'm letting into the yarn. And I've stopped to ply it on itself here, where I can see that the yarns are pretty consistent, so I don't have to worry about changes in my yarn gauge. But let's say you are spinning along and suddenly you get the feeling that you're spinning a little bit thicker. And I'll show you what that looks like when you stop to do your ply back. It looks okay, but when I ply it on itself, you can see there at the top it's actually a little bit thicker in one of the plies than the other, and so it's forming this sort of bubble in the yarn. Now, it would be a really nice art yarn, but if I'm trying to make a very consistent gauge, it's going to cause problems. So, you undo that, locate the spot where you think the transition in gauge is occurring, untwist just above that spot, and then untwist your fiber, and then you want to draft out that spot a little bit, get some twist into it, draft a little bit more, and that will get rid of the thicker spot in the yarn so that you don't have a dramatic change in your gauge. And then you stop and ply it back just to double check and see, I have now gotten rid of that bubble that was in one of the plies, and the yarn as a result looks very consistent as applied yarn. Now, this is really helpful even if you're not making applied yarn. If it's just a single, or if you're going to make 3 or 4 ply, this is a really good step to come back to periodically. Now, this is a bat that I have pulled off and pre-drafted before I've sat down with the wheel to spin it. But as you can see, it's actually a little bit thick, and so spreading out the fibers is a little bit difficult, so instead I'm going to just pre-draft it a bit more. And now I have done this for the other 2 bats, for the other 2 bobbins that I've already spun. And so if I just pull it out a bit more, then it's easier for me to draft while at the wheel. And so you can see the difference between the 2 different pre-drafts that I've done. The one on the left is much easier to spin while I'm at the wheel, whereas the other one, it's a little thicker, and to me it helps with keeping those inclusions in the bat where they should be, so they don't just fall off onto my lap. And so because I've consistently drafted and spun this way, it's going to be just fine. Now, the next thing that you can do to check is when you advance your yarn on yarn hooks like I've done here, you can stop and take this opportunity to check your gauge against the yarn that you've spun previously. So you just take that yarn and visually compare it against each of those little bumps, and then sort of see, is my gauge still consistent? And if not, sometimes you can make a very quick change in your gauge, so that if anything, there's a smaller section where your yarn grist is a little bit thicker but wouldn't be noticeable because it's such a small amount of yarn. And then you just keep spinning. Okay, so number 2, when you're plying, make sure that you consistently check back with your ply, because it's a really simple thing where you think, I can ply and it's not going to make a big deal, and it's usually faster than spinning each individual bobbin. However, you can end up with one skein that is overplied versus the other one, or vice versa. And what then happens is you have one that is fluffier, like one skein will be fluffier than the other, and that's actually going to impact your yarn gauge, because if you've gone for a really high twist in one skein but a really low twist in the other one, when you then wash both skeins, you will see differences in the way that the fibers puff out afterwards. And of course, that's also influenced by the type of fiber you use. If you use something with a lot of crimp like merino or cormo or Polwarth, then that poofiness is going to be much more dramatic. So again, that's another way that you might end up with a different yarn gauge, because it's not always in the spin, but in the ply. So my bonus tip is this. If you struggle with getting the right grist for your project, spin thin, then ply. So it might be difficult at first, overcoming the tedium of having to spin 3 bobbins of thinner yarn and then plying it, when you would rather go with 2 bobbins of a slightly thicker yarn in order to make the same gauge. However, as we discussed previously, it is a lot easier to control your yarn gauge if you can see how many fibers are going into that yarn. And when you have a yarn that you want to spin up to, let's say you want to spin up to a sport weight or a worsted yarn, if you spin thin and you can see how many fibers are going into those thinner yarns, then when you get to your sport weight or when you get to your worsted weight yarn, you will have a very consistent product throughout, because you've been able to more closely manage the gauge. Like I said earlier, it's not as easy if you've got a lot of fibers going into that yarn gauge. So I hope this video helped you out with yarn gauge and you learned some extra things. If you have other pointers, which I'm sure you probably do, please put them in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a like, share it around. You can also embed them on your blog or your website or wherever else. And as always, thanks for watching. Bye!